The grand hall of the Obsidian Palace was supposed to be a place where even the bravest warriors lowered their gaze, where the Alpha King's judgment echoed like a final sentence carved into stone, and where no one, absolutely no one, dared to interrupt the sacred proceedings of the Lunar Council. Yet on that night, everything shattered in a way no one could have predicted, because the heavy iron doors slammed open without permission, silencing the murmurs of dozens of nobles and ranked warriors seated in curved tiers of black marble. And every eye turned as a single figure stepped through the threshold, a woman draped in a dark traveling cloak that was far too ordinary for a place like this, her boots echoing against the stone with a defiance that didn't belong in a room governed by fear. And at the center of it all stood the Alpha King, Ijikalar Vireth, known across the 12 territories as the man who ended wars with a single command and ended bloodlines with a glance, his golden eyes already fixed on her, as though he had been waiting for this disruption long before it ever arrived. And the air itself seemed to tighten as she walked forward, ignoring the guards who reached for their blades, but hesitated under the king's subtle raised hand, because something in his expression had changed. Not anger, not surprise, but recognition, as if he had seen her in a dream he refused to admit existed. And the woman stopped directly beneath the towering throne of obsidian bone, lifting her head slowly until she met his gaze without hesitation. And that was when she said it, clear enough for every noble, every warrior, every advisor to hear, as if the world itself had paused to make room for her voice. "You're mine." And the words didn't echo like a mistake. They landed like a forbidden truth that cracked through centuries of hierarchy in a single breath. And for a moment, the entire hall expected fury, execution, punishment, anything that would restore order. But instead, something deeply unsettling happened. The Alpha King did not move, did not speak, did not even frown. He simply stared at her with a stillness that felt more dangerous than rage, as if her words had not offended him, but awakened something buried so deep inside him that even he did not fully understand it. And the silence stretched until it became unbearable, until even the elders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Because a king who does not react is far more terrifying than one who does. And then, slowly, deliberately, Kalor leaned forward from his throne, resting his elbow on the carved armrest as his gaze sharpened like a blade, being drawn not in anger but in curiosity. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, almost intimate in a way that sent unease rippling through the entire hall. "You say that as if you have the right." And she didn't look away, not even for a second, because this wasn't supposed to happen like this. Her mission was precision, infiltration, invisibility, not confrontation. Yet here she was standing in front of the most dangerous man in the realm, claiming him as if she understood something even he did not yet fully grasp. And behind her calm expression, her mind was racing because she knew the truth. She was not here by accident. She had been sent under false orders, under layers of manipulation designed to hide the real objective, and that objective was him, the Alpha King himself. But the moment she spoke those words, something shifted in the energy between them. Something that made her instincts scream that this man was not just observing her. He was measuring her like a puzzle piece he had already seen in fragments long before the full picture appeared. And Kalor rose from his throne slowly, descending the steps one by one with a controlled grace that made every guard instinctively tense. Yet none dared move, because their alpha had not given permission. And as he approached her, the distance between them felt less like space and more like pressure compressing the air, until he stopped just a few steps away, close enough that she could see the faint scars along his jawline, reminders of wars no one was allowed to ask about, and he tilted his head slightly as if studying a phenomenon he could not classify, then repeated her words softly, almost testing them like a curse or a prophecy. You are mine. And for the first time, her composure almost cracked, because the way he said it was not mocking, not rejecting, but acknowledging something dangerous, as if he was turning her claim over in his mind and finding it disturbingly familiar. And the nobles behind them began whispering in panic, some standing, some reaching for guards. But the Alpha King raised a single hand without looking away from her, and the entire hall fell silent again instantly. Absolute obedience born from fear and loyalty intertwined, and she realized in that moment that she had stepped into something far larger than she was trained for, because Kaelor Vireth was not reacting like a ruler defending his authority. He was reacting like a man recognizing a forgotten memory. And then he leaned in slightly, just enough that only she could hear him speak next, his voice no longer projecting to the hall, but cutting directly into her personal space like a private blade. If you truly believe that, then tell me your name. And that question should have been simple, yet it struck her harder than any threat, because names in their world were not just identity, they were allegiance, origin, truth. And she hesitated for the first time since entering the palace, and in that hesitation something flickered across his eyes. Confirmation, as if her pause itself had answered something for him, and the hall remained frozen as the two of them stood locked in a silence that felt like the beginning of a war no one else could see yet. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath layers of training and deception, a voice whispered that this man was not supposed to be her target alone, that perhaps she was never meant to infiltrate him, but to be found by him. And Kaelor's gaze darkened slightly as if he had reached the same conclusion, stepping even closer until there was no distance left between command and defiance, and the entire hall waited for the explosion that never came, because instead of rage, instead of punishment, instead of rejection, I, the Alpha King, simply said in a voice so quiet it felt like it belonged only to her, "Interesting. Then stay." And that single word changed everything, because it was not an order, not a threat, but an invitation wrapped in possession, and she realized too late that her entrance had not disrupted his court. It had completed something he had been anticipating, something she had not yet understood. And as the weight of every gaze in the hall pressed down on her, she felt the dangerous truth unfolding. She had not interrupted the Alpha King's world. She had just been revealed as part of it. And if you are watching this story unfold, pause for a second and ask yourself this. If you stood in that hall, facing someone who could destroy you with a thought, but looked at you like you were already his missing piece, would you step forward again, or turn away before the claim became real? The silence in the Obsidian Palace did not break after her words. It deepened, as if the entire structure itself had decided to hold its breath and wait for permission to exist again. And every person in that vast hall, nobles, warriors, advisors, even the execution guards stationed along the black marble walls, remained frozen in a state of disbelief that bordered on fear, because what had just been spoken was not merely disrespectful, it was impossible within the laws of the Alpha territories. And yet, she still stood there beneath the throne of Kaelor Vireth, her cloak slightly shifted from the movement of her arrival, her posture steady even though her heartbeat was anything but. And above her the Alpha King did not move from his position, his golden gaze still locked onto her like a predator studying something it had never seen in its hunting grounds before. And the tension that filled the space was not loud or chaotic, it was suffocatingly controlled. The kind of tension that builds before a collapse that no one can predict the shape of. And slowly Kaelor leaned back into his throne again, fingers resting against the obsidian armrest carved with ancient war sigils. And instead of commanding her removal or punishment as everyone expected, he spoke again, quieter this time, as though the question itself was more dangerous than any blade in the room. "You said I am yours, but tell me something before I decide what to do with that claim." And that single sentence shifted the entire energy of the hall, because it was not a denial, it was curiosity. And curiosity from an Alpha King was far more dangerous than anger, and she felt it immediately in the tightening of the air around her lungs, as if the palace itself was listening more closely now. And somewhere behind her she could hear the faint shift of armor as guards adjusted their stance, uncertain whether to prepare for violence or retreat. And yet she did not look back, because she knew that breaking eye contact now would mean surrendering control of the only fragile advantage she had, which was that she had caught his attention long enough to survive another breath. And Kalor's voice continued, smooth and measured, cutting through the silence like something sharpened over centuries of restraint. Do you understand what happens to those who claim what belongs to the throne without right? And the words were not a threat. They were a history lesson wrapped in warning, because everyone in that hall knew the answer. Those who made false claims against the Alpha King did not live long enough to regret them, but she also knew something they did not. Something hidden beneath layers of fabricated identity and classified mission files that had been burned before she ever stepped foot into the palace. She knew she was not supposed to be here, and yet every step she had taken to reach this hall had been guided by orders that did not feel entirely her own anymore, as if someone had rewritten the truth around her without telling her where the original version ended. And Kalor studied her silence as if reading those exact thoughts. And then he stood again, slowly, deliberately, descending the throne steps without breaking eye contact. Each step echoing through the hall like a countdown no one else could hear. And when he reached the base of the platform, he stopped only a few feet away from her, close enough now that the energy between them felt almost physical, like pressure pressing against skin. And he tilted his head slightly, voice dropping just enough that the surrounding court could still hear, but only she could feel the weight behind it. Or is it possible, he said, pausing as if choosing whether to continue, that you are not here by choice at all? And something inside her tightened at those words, because they were too precise, too close to a truth she had not been allowed to fully access in her own mission briefing. And for the first time since entering the palace, her mind flickered with uncertainty. Not about him, but about herself. Because the memory fragments she trusted were suddenly behaving like fragments instead of a whole, and that realization was dangerous, more dangerous than any Alpha King could ever be, because a soldier who cannot trust their own memory is already halfway to becoming someone else's weapon, and Kalor saw it in her expression, subtle but enough, and the faintest shadow of something unreadable crossed his face. Not triumph, not cruelty, but recognition, as if her instability confirmed something he had suspected long before she arrived. And behind them the nobles began to whisper again, no longer just about disrespect, but about something far more unsettling. The possibility that the Alpha King was not reacting to an intruder, but to a trigger he had been expecting. And one elder finally rose from his seat, voice trembling as he addressed the hall. My king, she must be detained immediately. This is an infiltration attempt. She has violated sacred court law. But Kalor did not even turn his head, his attention never leaving her, and that alone silenced the elder mid-sentence, because interrupting the Alpha King's focus was often more dangerous than the crime being discussed. And instead, Kalor spoke again, softer now, almost thoughtful. Tell me, he said, when you walked into this hall, did you come to kill me? To deceive me? Or to find something you have been missing without knowing it? And the question hit her harder than any physical blow, because it assumed too much, or perhaps revealed too much. And she felt her breath catch slightly as her training fought to maintain control, while something deeper inside her reacted in ways she had not authorized. And that was when she noticed it for the first time. The subtle shift in how the guards were positioned, not around the hall as usual, but angled inward toward her specifically, as if the entire palace had already decided she was the variable that needed containment. And yet, Kalor had not ordered her arrest, which meant either she was already under his control in ways she did not understand, or he was allowing this moment to unfold for reasons no one else in the room could comprehend. And she realized then that she had entered a battlefield where the rules were not written in advance, but revealed in real time by the man standing in front of her. And the danger of that realization was not just survival, but identity. Because if she was not here as herself, then who exactly had sent her? And why did Kalor Vareth look at her as if he already knew the answer? And the hall seemed to shrink around them as silence stretched again, heavier now, because everyone could feel that something irreversible was happening without knowing its shape. And Kalor finally spoke again, voice steady but lower. There is a truth you are carrying that you have not yet been allowed to remember. And at that statement, a faint chill ran through her chest because it aligned too closely with fragments of dreams she had dismissed as training hallucinations, visions of a sealed room, a voice calling her name in a tone she had not recorded in any official file, and a symbol burned into a metal door she had never been assigned to locate. And Kalor stepped even closer now, close enough that only she could hear the next words even though the entire hall leaned forward trying to catch them. "And if I am right," he said quietly, "then your presence here is not an intrusion. It is an answer." And that was the moment everything shifted because survival was no longer about escaping the Alpha King. It was about understanding whether she had been running toward him all along, and if the claim she made was not arrogance or madness, but recognition of something buried in both of them long before this meeting ever occurred. And somewhere deep in the hall, a blade slipped slightly from a guard's grip as tension peaked beyond control, but no one reacted. Because all attention was trapped in the space between their silence, and Kalor finally lifted his hand slowly, not in aggression, but in a gesture that halted every potential movement in the room, and then he asked the final question that shattered whatever certainty remained. "So I will ask you once more, not as a king, but as the man you claim belongs to you. Are you here to survive me, or to finally discover what part of you has been waiting for me to notice it first? And if you were standing in her place, with an entire court ready to judge your next breath, and a man powerful enough to erase your existence, treating your claim as if it might actually be true, would you still trust your mission? Or would you start questioning whether the real danger was not him at all, but the life you believed you were sent here to protect?" She did not answer him immediately, not because she lacked words, but because every instinct she had been trained to trust was suddenly colliding with something far older than training. Something buried beneath layers of constructed identity and carefully edited memories. And in the oppressive silence of the Obsidian Palace, she realized that hesitation itself was becoming dangerous, because the Alpha King was watching her, not like an intruder anymore, but like a cipher that had just begun to decrypt itself in real time. And as the tension stretched across the hall, Kalor Vareth remained still at a distance close enough to destroy her with a single motion. Yet he did not move. And that restraint was more unsettling than violence would have been, because it implied patience, and patience in a man like him meant calculation, not mercy. And somewhere behind her she could still feel the weight of the court's gaze pressing into her back like invisible chains, each noble waiting for permission to decide her fate. But none of them understanding that their king had already stepped into a different kind of engagement entirely, one that did not follow the rules of court judgment or political protocol. And then slowly Kalor turned his head slightly, not breaking his focus from her, but acknowledging the room with a single subtle command in his presence alone, and the whispering stopped again instantly, as if obedience was instinctive even when fear was rising. And it was in that controlled silence that she finally felt the shift inside herself fully register, because the mission she had been given was not supposed to feel like this. Not supposed to unravel under eye contact or voice tone or proximity, and yet every layer of certainty she had arrived with was now destabilizing, And she hated that she could feel it happening, because trained operatives were not supposed to question the foundation of their assignment mid-operation. And yet, she could no longer ignore the fractures appearing in her memory of how she got here, because she remembered being briefed in a sterile underground facility far from any known territory, under artificial light that never changed, surrounded by masked handlers who never used names, only codes. And she remembered being told that the Alpha King of the Obsidian Territories was the central node of a disappearing lineage investigation, a series of unexplained bloodline erasures that had destabilized 3 border regions. And she had been chosen not for diplomacy or infiltration alone, but for proximity sensitivity, because according to the briefing, she was the only one whose biological markers responded to alpha resonance fields without rejection, and that detail had been presented as scientific advantage, not personal significance. But now, standing in front of Kaelor Vireth, she was no longer certain that explanation was complete, because something inside her reacted to his presence in ways that no report had ever prepared her for, and Kaelor's voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts again, quieter now, less performative for the court and more precise, as if narrowing in on something only he could see. "You came into my hall without clearance, without declaration, without fear," he said, and then paused, studying her face as if searching for confirmation hidden beneath her expression. "That is not behavior of a rogue messenger or political spy," and her jaw tightened slightly because he was stripping away categories she had been taught to hide inside, and that made him more dangerous than the guards, because guards could be evaded, but perception could not. And he continued, stepping one pace closer again, forcing her to remain still or reveal weakness. "It is behavior of someone following an internal directive," and the words landed too accurately, too precisely, as if he was reading the architecture of her assignment instead of guessing it. And for a moment she wondered if he had access to her mission file. But that made no sense because the file had been classified under a system she herself had only seen once. And yet Kaelor Vireth was speaking like he had authored part of it, and that possibility alone was destabilizing enough to make her breathe slightly slower as she recalibrated. And he noticed that shift immediately, because he noticed everything. And that was when she realized the real danger of this mission was not exposure, but comprehension, because the deeper she understood him, the more she risked understanding herself. And that was never part of the assignment protocol. And then Kaelor spoke again, his tone shifting subtly as though transitioning from observation to interrogation without formal structure. "Tell me your designation," he said, not as a request, but as a command that bypassed authority layers and struck directly at trained obedience. And for a fraction of a second, her instincts almost responded automatically. I almost gave him the coded identifier she had used for years, but something stopped her. Something that felt less like resistance and more like fracture, because she realized that if she spoke that designation aloud here, in this hall, it would feel like betraying something she could not name. And that hesitation created another silence, heavier than the last, and Kaelor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition again, as if her refusal was also information. And then behind them, a distant sound echoed through the palace corridors. A metallic shift followed by a soft sequence of footsteps that did not belong to ceremonial guards. And Kaelor's attention flickered briefly toward the hall entrance, just enough for her to notice that even the Alpha King did not allow himself to be fully distracted. And in that brief moment, she saw something she had not seen before, a fracture in his absolute control. Not fear, not concern, but awareness of external systems operating parallel to this confrontation, and that realization tightened her internal suspicion further, because it suggested that her arrival was not isolated, and Kaelor turned back to her again, voice lower now, almost deliberately excluding the court from the next layer of truth. "You are not the first asset to arrive here under false memory scaffolding," he said. And the phrase hit her like cold recognition because she knew exactly what memory scaffolding meant in theory. But hearing it spoken here implied something far worse, that memory manipulation was not just possible in her world, but active and systematic. And her throat tightened slightly despite her control, because that meant her entire sense of self might not be continuous, and Kaylor continued, watching her reaction carefully. "And you are not the first to believe you came here on your own mission." And now the implication became unavoidable, because if that was true, then the mission itself might be constructed rather than assigned. And she felt a subtle shift in her balance as she processed the possibility that she might be a component in someone else's architecture rather than an independent operative. And Kaylor finally stopped in front of her fully now, close enough that she could see the faint patterning in his irises, like molten gold fractured by shadow, and he lowered his voice so only she could hear, though the court strained to catch every syllable. "Your mission was never to infiltrate me," he said. "It was to reach this exact moment." And that sentence was the most dangerous one yet because it removed randomness entirely from her existence here, and she almost stepped back instinctively but restrained herself, because stepping back would mean acknowledging fear, and fear would mean conceding control, and she refused to give him that. And yet internally she was no longer sure who him even was in that thought anymore, because Kaylor Vareth was no longer just an opposing figure, he was becoming a reference point around which her entire understanding of mission structure was reorganizing. And then, he did something unexpected. He turned his head slightly toward the side of the hall and spoke a single word. "Open." And at first, nothing happened. And then the far wall of the chamber, a section she had assumed was architectural reinforcement, began to shift with mechanical precision, revealing a narrow passage behind the throne chamber that no one in the court had acknowledged before, and gasps rippled through the nobles as hidden architecture became visible. And Kaylor did not look at them, only at her, as if their reactions were irrelevant compared to hers. And she realized then that the palace itself contained layers she had never been shown in her briefing, and that meant her intelligence was incomplete. And incomplete intelligence in a place like this was equivalent to walking blindfolded through a war zone. And Kaylor gestured subtly toward the opening. "You were sent to find what is hidden," he said. "So stop pretending you do not already feel it." And she hated that he was right about the sensation, because she could feel it, not as knowledge but as pull, like something inside her reacting to something inside that hidden passage. And for the first time since entering the hall, she shifted her stance not in defiance, but in decision-making weight. And Kaylor noticed that too. And that was when she understood the core of her mission was no longer about extraction, or surveillance, or verification. It was about whether she would follow that pull into the unknown or remain in the safety of what she thought she knew. And Kaylor's final words in this exchange were quieter than everything before, but they landed deeper than anything else. "If you step through that door, you will not be the same version of yourself that entered this hall." And he paused, letting the weight settle. "And I suspect you already know that is exactly why you were brought here." And the court behind them remained silent, but not passive anymore, because now they were witnesses to something no longer fully political, and she stood at the threshold of a choice that was no longer just mission success or failure, but identity versus truth. And if you were standing where she stood, with a hidden passage opening before you, a king who seemed to know your purpose better than you did, and a life that suddenly felt like it may have been constructed around you rather than lived by you, would you trust the mission that brought you here? Or step into the unknown and risk discovering that everything you believed about yourself was only the beginning of a much larger design? Kaler Vireth did not move the moment the hidden passage revealed itself behind the throne chamber, and that stillness alone was enough to make the entire hall feel like it had been placed inside a pressure chamber, where even breathing had consequences. Because while the nobles and warriors erupted into controlled chaos behind their forced silence, whispering in panic about forbidden architecture and sealed royal layers, the Alpha King remained focused entirely on her, as if the world itself had narrowed down to a single variable he needed to solve. And in that focus, there was no hesitation, no distraction, no emotional leakage that anyone could interpret as weakness, only a precise, disciplined awareness that made him more unsettling than any storm or battlefield rumor ever attached to his name. And she felt it directly. She standing at the edge of that revealed passage with her cloak slightly shifting from the faint draft escaping the hidden corridor. Because Kalor Virith was not just a ruler who commanded obedience, he was someone who had mastered the art of withholding reaction until reaction itself became irrelevant to others, and that level of control was not natural. It was trained, sharpened, and likely survived through loss that no one in the court was allowed to speak about. And yet, what made him even more dangerous in that moment was not his silence, but the way he observed her reaction to the passage, because while others saw a hidden door, he saw what it did to her. How her breathing subtly changed, how her stance recalibrated, how something inside her responded before her mind could authorize it. And that observation alone was enough to suggest that Kalor Vireth was not merely reacting to events. He was reading systems beneath them, and she hated that she could feel herself being read so accurately, because trained operatives were supposed to be unreadable, and yet standing in front of him she felt like a page left open under a torchlight she could not extinguish. And Kalor finally spoke again, voice steady and calm in a way that contrasted violently with the tension in the room. "You are afraid," he said, not as accusation, but as observation, and that simplicity was more invasive than interrogation because it removed her ability to deny it without lying to herself, and she straightened slightly, forcing control back into her posture. But he did not acknowledge the correction because he had already registered it. And, instead, he took a step sideways, finally breaking the direct line between them but not the psychological hold he had established. And as he moved, the court shifted subtly with him, because even in distance he dictated the shape of attention, and he walked toward the edge of the throne platform, eyes briefly scanning the hidden passage again before returning to her. And when he spoke this time, it was less like a command and more like structured truth being offered in fragments. "This palace is not what your intelligence files described," he said, and she felt a subtle tightening in her chest at that, because he was acknowledging external knowledge systems without naming them, as if he knew exactly what level of information she had been given before arriving. And Kalor continued, "There are sections of this structure that predate my rule, predating even the first recorded Alpha Convergence Treaty. And that detail mattered because it meant the hidden passage was not an anomaly created recently, but part of something ancient, something that had survived political restructuring and war purges, and she could feel the implication forming beneath his words, like something deliberately not yet revealed. And Kalor turned slightly toward the court now, finally acknowledging them again, but not addressing them, more like reminding them of their place within his awareness. "You all believe you are witnessing a breach," he said, and a few nobles stiffened as if caught in accusation. "But you are witnessing structure revealing itself." And that statement shifted the tension again because it reframed the entire event from violation to inevitability. And when Kalor reframes reality, people listen even when they do not understand, because history had proven that his interpretations often became law after the fact. And she realized that part of his danger was not physical power alone, but narrative control. The ability to define what events meant after they occurred, and that kind of authority made resistance not just difficult, but conceptually unstable, because opposing him meant opposing the version of reality he had already begun to construct. And then he looked back at her again, and there was something sharper in his expression now. Not emotion, but precision, like a blade aligned before impact, and he said quietly, "You were not sent here to observe me," and paused, letting the words settle into her awareness. "You were sent here because I would notice you." And that statement forced a fracture in her internal logic, because it removed her agency from the center of the mission and replaced it with his awareness as the initiating condition. And she did not like how coherent that possibility felt, because it implied her entire assignment structure was reactive rather than independent. And Kaylor saw that internal conflict register on her face, and continued without giving her space to stabilize. "Do you know what makes an alpha dangerous beyond strength?" he asked, and then answered himself before she could respond. "Control that extends beyond the self." And he lifted his hand slightly, not in a gesture of command but illustration. "Most rulers control armies," he said. "Some control territories." And then his gaze sharpened again. "I control what is allowed to be perceived." And that line changed the atmosphere in a subtle but irreversible way, because it implied that perception itself within this kingdom was not neutral. And that meant her intelligence gathering, her observational certainty, even her memory integrity could all be compromised not by force, but by design. And she felt a faint pressure behind her eyes as she tried to reconcile that with everything she had been trained to trust. And Kaylor stepped closer again, closing the distance he had created earlier, and this time there was no hesitation in his movement, only intention. And when he stopped in front of her again, he lowered his voice so that only she could hear. But the court could feel the shift in intensity even without words. "You think you are here to infiltrate a king," he said softly. "But infiltration implies a boundary I did not already anticipate." And he tilted his head slightly, studying her again. "I do not have boundaries in the way you understand them." And that was not arrogance. It was structure. And she realized that if what he said was true, then conventional mission frameworks were insufficient against him because he operated outside the assumptions those frameworks required. And Kaylor continued, "You keep looking for your objective as if it is external to you." And his gaze dropped briefly to her chest level before returning to her eyes. "But I am telling you, it is not." And that statement created a subtle but disturbing alignment with something she had not yet admitted to herself, because part of her awareness since entering the hall had been shifting, not toward extraction or survival, but toward understanding him, and that deviation from mission focus was supposed to be impossible without external interference or psychological compromise. And yet it was happening without her consent. And Kaylor seemed to notice her realization unfolding, because his expression changed slightly, not into satisfaction, but into something closer to confirmation of a pattern he had already encountered before. And he spoke again, quieter now, almost detached. "There are only two types of people who enter this palace without breaking," he said. "Those who already belong to it, and those who are being rewritten by it." And the weight of that distinction settled heavily because it suggested that her current identity might not be stable. And Kaylor turned slightly toward the hidden passage again, then back to her, as if weighing decisions across multiple layers simultaneously, and then he said something that reframed everything once more. "The reason you feel pulled toward that passage is not curiosity," he said. "It is recognition." And that word, recognition, struck deeper than the rest, because recognition implies prior connection, prior knowledge, prior existence of relationship that predates conscious memory. And she felt a subtle tightening in her chest at the implication that her reaction might not be new but remembered. And Kaylor's voice softened slightly but did not lose control. "I am dangerous," he said plainly, as if stating fact rather than warning. "Not because I destroy what opposes me, but because I remain unchanged while everything around me adjusts." And he paused briefly, letting that settle. Including people. And she understood then that what made him unreadable was not lack of emotion, but discipline so absolute that emotion never interfered with function. And Kaylor continued, "You are trying to categorize me as enemy, ally, target, anomaly." And he shook his head slightly. "But I am not contained by categories." And that realization was destabilizing because human cognition relies on categorization to maintain clarity under stress. And he was removing that structure from her understanding of him. And then he did something unexpected again. He turned slightly toward the court and spoke in a louder voice, not to her alone, but to everyone. "Leave," he said. And it was not shouted, not emphasized, just absolute. And the effect was immediate as guards and nobles hesitated only a fraction of a second before obeying. Because when the Alpha King dismisses an audience, refusal is not an option that survives logic, and within moments the hall began to empty in controlled motion, leaving only echoing footsteps and the faint sound of armor shifting as distance increased. And yet he did not break eye contact with her, even as the room emptied. And when the last noble disappeared beyond the corridor arches, silence returned. But different now, less performative, more concentrated. And Kaylor finally spoke again in that quieter space. "Now there are no witnesses," he said. "Only variables." And he gestured slightly toward the hidden passage. "And the truth waiting behind me." And she realized then that the danger of Kaylor Virith was not that he could kill her, or command her, or outthink her, but that he could rearrange the entire context of her existence until even her mission began to lose its original meaning. And standing there between him and the unknown passage, she had to confront the most uncomfortable possibility yet. That the Alpha King was not the obstacle in her mission, but the reason she had a mission at all. And if that was true, then the question was no longer whether she could survive him, but whether she could survive the truth. He was slowly forcing her to recognize about herself. And if you were in her position, standing alone in a throne chamber with a king who does not need to raise his voice to command reality itself, would you still trust the identity you arrived with, or begin to suspect that the most dangerous thing in the room was not him, but the version of you that believes it knows why it is there? The palace did not return to normal after the hall was emptied, because nothing in the Obsidian Kingdom ever truly returned to normal once the Alpha King had altered the flow of attention, and even in silence there was residue. A kind of invisible pressure left behind in the air that made every corridor feel like it was still remembering what had just happened, and she could feel it as she stood near the edge of the throne chamber, no longer in front of the court, no longer under immediate observation from the nobles, but still not free from him, because Kaylor Virith remained there in a way that did not depend on proximity alone. And as the hidden passage behind the throne remained partially open like a wound in the structure of the palace, he finally turned away from her for the first time in what felt like an intentional act rather than distraction, walking slowly toward the edge of the raised platform as if the weight of authority itself adjusted with each step. And she watched him carefully, because this was where most people made mistakes. When they assumed silence meant safety, but Kaylor's silence was never absence, it was preparation. And below them, the palace was already shifting into its evening transition, servants moving through lower corridors, guards repositioning in patterns that were not random but layered like overlapping surveillance grids. And somewhere far beyond the throne chamber, the rest of the palace was resuming its public illusion of order, unaware that the foundation beneath them had already been exposed. And Kaylor spoke without looking at her, voice calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing something routine instead of structural secrecy embedded in royal architecture. "You will attend the banquet tonight," he said, and it was not a question, not a suggestion, but a declaration of timeline, and she turned slightly toward him, not out of submission but calculation, because the idea of being placed into a social environment after what had just happened was not coincidence. It was strategy. And he continued before she could respond. There will be observers there who will attempt to measure you. And he paused briefly as if selecting the correct phrasing. And there will be those who attempt to mislead you. And finally he turned his head slightly, enough that she could see the edge of his expression, unreadable as always but sharper now. And you will allow both. And that instruction immediately triggered resistance in her training because operatives were not meant to allow deception without counteraction. But Kaylor was not speaking from the perspective of field containment. He was speaking as someone who understood that social environments in his kingdom were not neutral gatherings. They were layered arenas of influence where truth was never directly spoken but continuously shaped. And she realized that what he was sending her into was not a banquet in the traditional sense, but a controlled field of indirect confrontation. And Kaylor descended from the platform slowly now, moving toward the side corridor that led deeper into the palace interior. And as he passed her, he spoke again, without stopping. "Do not correct the lies," he said quietly. "Observe who benefits from them." And that distinction mattered more than it should have, because it reframed deception not as error, but as structure. And she followed him at a distance as he led her through a series of dimly lit corridors that she had not seen during her initial entry. Corridors lined with portraits of past rulers whose eyes seemed to track movement even when still. And she noticed something subtle as they walked. These servants they passed along the way did not react to Kaylor with surprise or curiosity, only controlled deference, which meant her presence was the anomaly, not his movement. And that alone confirmed that whatever he had planned for her at the banquet was already expected by parts of the palace hierarchy, and that meant her arrival was not disruptive in their system. It was anticipated within it, and that thought tightened her awareness, because anticipation implies preparation, and preparation implies prior knowledge. And she was beginning to suspect that the palace itself was not reacting to her arrival in real time, but responding to a script that already existed before she stepped through the doors. And Kaylor stopped at a junction where 3 corridors met, turning to face her fully now. And for the first time in this sequence, there was something closer to instruction than observation in his tone. "You will be introduced as a foreign envoy," he said, and she noted immediately that he was assigning her a role that did not match her original mission identity, which meant either he was concealing her true purpose or overriding it entirely. And he continued, "You will not correct anyone who misidentifies your origin." And she frowned slightly at that because identity misclassification was a vulnerability in intelligence operations. But Kaylor added before she could challenge it, misidentification reveals intent. And that line made her pause because it implied that false assumptions in social environments were not just noise, they were signals. And Kaylor stepped closer slightly, lowering his voice. "Tonight is not about truth," he said. "It is about distribution of belief." And that phrasing unsettled her because belief was not something she had been trained to treat as operational variable, but in his framework it clearly was. And then he gestured subtly toward a corridor on the left. "That path leads to preparation chambers," he said. "You will be escorted there." And then he paused, studying her again with that same controlled precision. "And you will wear what is given to you." And she almost responded instinctively against that, because clothing in infiltration environments was not just appearance. It was concealment and functionality. But she stopped herself because she was beginning to understand that resisting instructions here, without understanding context, was more dangerous than compliance. And Kaylor seemed satisfied with her silence because he turned away again, but before he left, he added one final line without looking back. "And remember, tonight no one will tell you the truth directly." And then he was gone down the corridor in a controlled, silent movement that left her standing alone in a space that now felt less like transition and more like threshold. And within minutes, two palace attendants appeared, neither speaking, both maintaining neutral expressions that did not acknowledge her presence as unusual, and they guided her through another set of corridors into a preparation suite that was significantly more elaborate than anything she had expected, filled with fabrics, jewelry, and ceremonial garments that clearly belonged to high-ranking court functions. And the moment she stepped inside, she realized something important. This was not improvisation, it was staged readiness, as if her participation in tonight's banquet had been accounted for long before her arrival, and that realization created the first real crack in her understanding of the mission structure, because if her presence had been anticipated in detail, then her assignment could not have been a spontaneous infiltration directive, and that meant either her handlers had knowledge she had not been given, or Kaelor Virith was operating with intelligence systems that extended beyond her organization entirely. And as attendants began laying out garments for her, she noticed subtle differences in how they avoided eye contact, not out of fear, but restraint, as if acknowledging her too directly would violate protocol. And one of them finally spoke in a quiet voice, almost absent-minded. The king requested the midnight attire set, and then immediately corrected themselves for the foreign envoy, as if even naming her incorrectly had been rehearsed, and that correction revealed something more important than the statement itself, because it implied multiple identity layers already active within palace communication channels, and she felt a subtle tightening in her chest as she realized she was not being dressed for a simple banquet, but being placed into a narrative role within a broader social structure. And as she stood there while attendants adjusted fabric and prepared accessories, she began to notice small inconsistencies in how they worked, how they avoided certain colors, how they paused briefly before touching specific garments as if those items carried significance beyond aesthetics, and she overheard fragments of conversation between them that were carefully subdued, mentioning alignment, observation tier, and alpha attention. And each phrase suggested that the banquet was not merely social gathering but layered observation event, and she understood then that she was not just being introduced to the court, she was being placed on display within a controlled environment where every reaction would be monitored, interpreted, and possibly recorded. And that meant Kaelor was not simply testing her presence. He was testing how the entire system responded to her presence, and when she was finally dressed in dark ceremonial attire that felt both elegant and restrictive in equal measure, she was led through another corridor toward the banquet hall, and as she approached, she could already hear the sound of controlled conversation, music structured to allow speech intervals rather than distract from them, and laughter that felt carefully timed rather than spontaneous. And Kaelor was already there when she entered, standing near the central table not as host performing ritual introduction, but as anchor point around which everyone else oriented themselves. And the moment she appeared at the entrance of the hall, the entire room subtly recalibrated, conversations slowing, eyes shifting in coordinated unpredictability, and she immediately recognized that nothing here was natural social flow. It was structured attention management, and Kaelor's gaze met hers instantly across the room, not surprised, not acknowledging delay, just confirming arrival as if it were expected at that exact second. And in that moment, she felt the first full crack in reality deepen, because everything she had assumed about palace hierarchy, mission structure, and even her own autonomy was beginning to reorganize under the weight of a system she had not been informed existed. And the Alpha King stood at the center of it all as if he had never been part of the system at all, but the one defining its boundaries. And if you were standing at that entrance, feeling every gaze in the room recalibrate around your presence, while the most powerful man in the kingdom watched you like you were already accounted for in a plan you never saw, would you still trust your mission briefing? Or would you begin to suspect that the social world you just entered was not a place you were sent into, but a stage you were always meant to step onto at a very specific moment in a script? You are only now beginning to realize you were never fully allowed to read. The banquet hall did not feel like a celebration the moment she stepped fully inside. It felt like an evaluation chamber disguised as elegance, where every crystal chandelier, every arranged floral centerpiece, every slow-moving servant, and every carefully spaced noble seat formed part of a system designed not for enjoyment but for observation, and as she crossed the threshold, she immediately felt it, that subtle tightening in the atmosphere that always followed her presence in spaces where she was not supposed to be fully understood, because conversations did not stop, but they adjusted. Laughter continued but softened. Han, and even the music seemed to recalibrate its tempo as if responding to an unseen directive. And at the center of it all stood Kalor Vareth, the Alpha King, positioned not at the throne of the hall, but slightly off-center near a long obsidian table, as though he refused to be framed as the sole focal point even while remaining the unavoidable axis around which everything turned. And when his gaze met hers across the room, there was no surprise in it. No acknowledgement of arrival, only confirmation, as if her presence at this exact moment was not new information but completion of a scheduled variable, and that alone made something inside her tighten because anticipation at that level implied orchestration, not reaction, and she began walking forward slowly, aware that every step she took was being registered not just socially but structurally, because this was not a banquet in the way she had been trained to interpret such events. This was layered observation, where alliances were tested through proximity, loyalty through silence, and truth through contradiction. And as she moved deeper into the hall, she noticed the first subtle anomaly. Certain nobles were not looking at her with curiosity or hostility, but with recognition that felt rehearsed, as if they had been briefed about her arrival in a version of reality she had never been included in, and Kalor finally spoke without raising his voice. Yet, it carried cleanly across the hall anyway. "You arrived on time," he said, and that statement was not praise or greeting. It was alignment confirmation. Dachen, and she reached the space beside him just as the surrounding court resumed its carefully controlled motion, and he did not turn to her fully, only angled slightly, enough to indicate acknowledgement without breaking his attention from the room, and then he added, "Observe carefully." And she realized that was not instruction for etiquette, it was directive for survival, because as she looked around more deliberately now, she noticed patterns she had missed during entry. Pairs of nobles seated in mirrored positions exchanging coded gestures beneath the table. Servants circulating in intervals that did not correspond to service needs, but to information relay cycles, and guards positioned not at exits, but at conversational intersections. And she understood then that this banquet was not a social gathering at all. It was a structured intelligence exchange operating in plain sight under ceremonial cover, and Kalor leaned slightly closer, voice low enough that only she could hear. "This is where truth becomes currency," he said, "and lies become architecture." And before she could respond, a noble from the far side of the table rose, an older man with ceremonial insignia that suggested high council authority, and he lifted his glass in a gesture that looked like toast but carried undertones of challenge. "My king," he said, smiling carefully, "we are honored by your guest." And the word guest landed with intentional ambiguity, because it neither confirmed her status nor denied it, and she immediately understood she was being tested through language framing, and Kalor did not correct him, which meant the ambiguity was deliberate. And the noble continued, eyes now shifting toward her. "It is rare for outsiders to be granted proximity during inner court cycles." And again, that phrasing suggested she had been placed into a category she did not recognize, and she felt the weight of multiple gazes settle on her as the noble waited for her response, and Kalor finally spoke quietly beside her. "You may answer. he said. And that permission itself was revealing because it implied structured control over her participation in discourse, and she chose her words carefully. I was invited, she said simply, and the noble's smile tightened slightly, because that answer did not confirm origin, allegiance, or purpose. It only confirmed entry, and that was when she noticed the first crack in reality deepen further. And because another noble at the far end of the table leaned toward his companion and whispered something that made the companion visibly tense, and she caught fragments of it, something about alignment verification and sealed designation, phrases that should not have been circulating in public court speech, and Kaylor's expression remained unchanged. But his fingers tapped once against the table surface, a subtle signal that caused two attendants behind the seating arrangement to adjust position slightly, and she realized even micro-movements were being monitored and responded to. And the noble who had spoken earlier continued, now turning more directly toward Kaylor. There are concerns, he said, regarding unauthorized resonance presence within the palace structure. And that phrase, resonance presence, made her stomach tighten because it was not standard political terminology, it was technical. And Kaylor finally turned his full attention to the noble, and the hall subtly quieted further, because when the Alpha King fully directs his focus, conversation becomes secondary reality, and he said calmly, concerns are only valid when they are informed. And the noble hesitated, because that was a dismissal disguised as logic, and Kaylor continued, and yours are not. And that ended the exchange immediately, but not the tension, because what had been implied was that certain factions within the court possessed awareness of something she had not been told. And before she could process that fully, a second voice spoke from a different section of the table, younger, sharper, belonging to a woman wearing deep violet court insignia. If she is what you claim her to be, the woman said, eyes fixed on Kaylor but indirectly addressing her, then the protocol breach is already active. And Kaylor did not look at her immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward the far edge of the hall, where a set of double doors remained closed, and then he said quietly, "It is already active." And the moment he said that, the atmosphere shifted again, because confirmation of breach status in this context meant something operational, not ceremonial. And suddenly she realized the banquet was not just observation, it was containment monitoring. And she looked at Kaylor more directly now. It's because that admission changed everything about his role, and he finally met her gaze fully, and for the first time since she entered the hall, there was something almost unguarded in his expression. Not vulnerability, but clarity. And he said in a tone only she could hear, "You are not the only one being evaluated here." And before she could respond, the room lights subtly dimmed in a controlled sequence, signaling transition phase, and Kaylor rose slightly from his position, and that alone caused the entire hall to settle into structured silence again, and he spoke louder now for all to hear. "We proceed," he said, and attendants began moving in synchronized patterns as if responding to pre-coded instructions. And the noble who had questioned earlier leaned toward another and whispered urgently. But Kaylor's gaze flicked once in their direction, and they stopped immediately, and she realized control here was not enforced continuously. It was enforced selectively at precise moments of deviation. And then, as dishes were cleared and replaced in ritual order, she felt a presence approach behind her, and she turned slightly to see a palace envoy she had not noticed before. Someone whose insignia was unfamiliar even within the court hierarchy. And the envoy leaned in slightly and spoke softly. "You were not listed in the original convergence profile." And that sentence struck harder than expected because it implied predictive mapping. And before she could respond, the envoy placed a small folded object on the edge of the table near her seat and walked away without waiting for acknowledgement. And Kaylor noticed immediately but did not react outwardly, only shifted his gaze toward the object briefly. and she waited until attention around them shifted before discreetly opening it beneath the table, revealing a thin metal shard inscribed with a symbol she had seen once before in fragmented memory during briefing debrief suppression cycles. And as she stared at it, a sudden fragmented memory surged, not clear but emotionally charged. A room beneath the palace, voices arguing about subject continuity failure and alpha resonance binding deviation. And her breath caught slightly as she realized the memory was not external intelligence, but internal recall. And Kaylor leaned closer again without looking at her, speaking softly. "You recognize it now," he said, and it was not a question, and she turned her head slightly toward him, and he continued, "That is not evidence," he said. "It is confirmation." And at that exact moment across the hall, the noble who had earlier challenged her stood abruptly, and this time there was no controlled speech, only urgency. "She is not a foreign envoy," he said loudly. "She is a reactivated sequence asset." And the hall erupted in immediate controlled disruption, not chaos but coordinated response, guards shifting, attendants freezing, nobles recalculating positions, and Kaylor did not move quickly. He simply exhaled once and said quietly, "So it has begun." And she turned fully toward him now because that statement carried implication beyond the banquet, beyond court politics. And he finally looked at her directly again and said the words that shattered the last assumption she had left. "You were never sent here to spy on me," he said. "You were sent here to wake something I locked away." And for the first time, she felt fear that was not about survival but identity, because if she was a trigger rather than an agent, then everything she believed about her mission, her autonomy, even her origin could be constructed around a function she did not consent to, and the envoy who had delivered the shard earlier was now standing at the edge of the hall speaking into a hidden device, and Kaylor's gaze followed that motion briefly before returning to her. And in that moment she understood the true betrayal was not only external, but systemic, because someone in her chain of command had known exactly what she was walking into, and had not stopped it. And Kaylor spoke one final time, quietly but decisively. "The court believes you are the threat," he said. "I know you are the key." And then he stood fully, and the entire hall shifted in response, and he extended his hand not as command, but as alignment. And in that suspended moment between accusation and revelation, between betrayal and truth exposure, between being weapon and being person, she realized the only stable thing in the entire room was the man everyone else called Alpha King, and everything else, including her mission, was now structurally uncertain. And if you were standing in her position with half the court ready to classify you as threat, a hidden symbol burning in your hand, and the most dangerous man in the kingdom offering alignment instead of execution, would you still trust the people who sent you here? Or would you begin to accept that the real enemy was not in front of you, but inside the system that decided what you were before you ever arrived?